great pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker today, Mimi Scheller. Mimi Scheller is one of the leading voices in contemporary social theory and pioneering figure in the new mobility paradigm. She is the founding co-editor of the Journal of Mobilities and the co-director of the Center of Mobilities in Lancaster University, both of which are the main reference of mobility studies. Together with John Orre, she articulated the foundation of this vibrant field called mobility studies, which has become a cornerstone for scholars examining the movement of people, goods, information, and ideas across space and time. These contributions have transformed the studies of diasporas, mobilities, and transcultural exchanges across diverse fields such as sociology, history, anthropology, political science, and literary studies, all fields that we are working on. Since 2021, Professor Scheller has served as Dean of Global School of Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. Previously, she was Professor of Sociology in Drexel University, where she also directed the Center for Mobilities Research and Policy. Trained as a sociologist, she is an interdisciplinary social scientist with a background in historical studies and literature. Her early works, Democracy After Slavery, Black Publics and Peasants, Radicalism in Haiti and Jamaica, published with Macmillan in 2000, and Consuming the Caribbean from Arawaks to Zombies, published with Routledge in 2003, historicizes and critically examines the politics and representation of Caribbean from the late 18th century to the present. Her work has fundamentally reshaped how we understand movement, not only as a physical displacement, but as a complex social, political, and cultural process that structures our world over the course of her career. She has produced a remarkable body of scholarship spanning disciplines and geographies with particular attention to post-colonial Caribbean. She has published 150 articles and book chapters and is the author or co-editor of 15 books. Jesus Christ, I was quite surprised when I started to realize that the amount of publications. Among these, my favorite is Mobility Justice, The Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes, published with Verso 2018. Her concept of mobility justice invites us to confront the uneven distribution of mobility across the globe, revealing how systems of power shaped by colonial histories, racial inequalities, and economic disparities enable some forms of movement while restricting others. At the same time, her more recent work addressed the urgent challenge posed by climate change, examining how environmental crises are reshaping patterns of mobility and displacement, often exacerbating existing inequalities. Professor Scheller's research has been particularly influential, illuminating the historical and contemporary dynamics of the Caribbean, tracing how tourism, migration, and diasporic connections are deeply entangled with the legacies of colonialism. At the heart of her work lies a powerful and timely question: who has the right to move and under what conditions? These contributions resonate profoundly with the academic mission of CHAM, where diverse research on diasporas and global studies is conducted across fields. And with the conference that we started today on the MOVE, Diasporas, Mobilities, and Transcultural Practice in a Changing World. Professor Scheller's work not only provide us with conceptual tools to understand mobility within the humanities, but also challenge us to think critically about the ethical and political dimension to be on the move. It is a privilege to welcome a scholar whose work continues to inspire new ways of thinking about climate, mobility, justice, and global interconnection. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mimi Scheller.
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you in this conference, which is a wonderful topic. I'm very happy to be speaking to this particular group of people because, as you heard, my work began in history and literature and the humanities and kind of gradually shifted to more of a social sciences perspective. But I always have in mind those deep histories of, especially of the Atlantic world and transatlantic, both northern and southern mobilities, informing all of the work that I do. So today, because of the emphasis on diasporas and migration in your conference title, I'm going to be speaking on some of my work that has to do with migration and mobilities, but I'll be pointing towards a new concept that I'm going to be working on. I've written a little bit about, but I hope to produce more over the following year when I'll be on sabbatical, on the concept of mobile commoning. And I don't know how well commoning translates into Portuguese, so I hope the concept will make sense as I try to explain it. So mobility is not just about movement, but is also about the relation between mobilities and immobilities, indicated by the idea of immobilities, where I put the IM often in parentheses, to emphasize these connected phenomena. Oh, I can do it, yeah. Mobilities and immobilities, displacement and dwelling, circulation and stillness are each relational concepts whose meanings, values, and justification shadow each other. Every movement and every choice to remain in place is part of a system of kinopolitics, that is, the politics of mobility, that today produces violence at the border and the regulation of everyday movement through public space. Kinopolitics refers to the politics of mobility, meaning the ways in which control over one's own and others' movement is a form of power that is both interpersonal. We can think of relations of a kind of control or domination, for example, such as patriarchy or racism, which controls people's mobilities in everyday life. And it's also controlled by forms of state regulation and control, such as policing and laws around legitimate access to streets, to public places, and of course to cross borders, which allow some people freedom of movement while stopping or arresting the mobility of others. Additionally, kinopolitics also refers to the mobility of politics. That is, the sense that political participation requires the right to assemble, the right to march, to occupy public space, to strike, to blockade. Groups of people exercise political power through forms of mobilizing or stopping mobilities, as indicated by the name we call social movements. They are, of course, moving. When states or other power holders seek to impede social mobilization, they often do so by literally stopping people's mobilities. That is, by banning gatherings, by stopping marches, or literally by arresting and jailing protesters. The ultimate control over human mobilities is the determination of who belongs to the nation, who may enter the country's borders. A citizen has the right to stay, at least most of the time, not always today. Others are given temporary leave to enter. I used to be a permanent, like a resident of the UK, and I was amazed when I got this kind of official piece of paper that said the Queen gave me leave to enter, and to remain for a set period of time. Others are deemed illegal entrants and can be detained and deported, as we are seeing increasingly in the United States today. In the face of a changing climate, though, many human mobilities across borders have become highly contested. The climate crisis poses challenges to the existing protections for refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants that were created in the post-World War II era. Many states have turned to policies of border closure, wall building, and mass deportation in an effort to deter what is called illegal migration. In contrast to this, the mobility justice theoretical framework that I will be talking about today calls for a kinopolitical approach that recognizes the growing impacts of climate disruption on human mobilities and immobilities in this era of man-made climate change that we call the Anthropocene. And, just to this slide summarizes some of the aspects of mobility justice that I write about in the book of that name. And just to summarize the key concept, that mobility justice is a way to frame the entanglements of power and social exclusion in the mobilities of humans, things, and information. So it's about how that power produces differential and unequal access to movement, capabilities to move, but also decision-making power over the mobilities and immobilities of oneself and of others. So sociologists have long recognized that spatial injustices and uneven mobilities are shaped by differentiated citizenship regimes through which, as Zygmunt Bauman said more than a quarter century ago, it is now the access to global mobility which has been raised to the topmost rank among the stratifying factors. Over the last 25 years, this access has become more and more determined by a kind of closing off of the global north to multitudes of people, especially many who have been displaced by ecological disruption and the violence, the social violence or the wars that accompany a race for control over intensifying extractive industries. Within a geo-ecological, long historical perspective, the uneven distribution of resources such as oil, metals, or even clean water, and also the distribution of the impacts of extractive industries, of hydrocarbon pollution, of exposure to climate risks. It is this long geo-ecological relation that produces local vulnerabilities to climate change hazards, the natural and unnatural disasters that drive climate displacement and migration fall hardest upon the former colonies and peripheries of the world system, the very places where extractive industries pollute the land and water at the same time that droughts and floods and extreme heat and storms push agricultural sustainability to the brink. This is what we refer to as Anthropocene mobilities. And I'm drawing it partly on work that I've published some with Andreas Neef, but also other collaborators who are sometimes use this term of Anthropocene mobilities to indicate both the extraction and consumption of fossil fuel energy for high mobility lifestyles of some groups and the related displacement of others who are forced to move by climate disruption and associated political upheavals, yet who are not allowed to cross borders legally. By understanding climate displacement as something driven by our fossil-fueled way of life, that is, those in the global north, but in particular the wealthiest elites who travel and consume the most energy, and also of the military-industrial complex of the global north that ultimately controls worldwide access to oil, natural gas, metals, and other extractive resources, as we are seeing in the current wars over the control of those resources, we begin on a better footing to discuss people displaced by climate change, right? When we put it in that broad geohistorical context. And these broader kinopolitical issues surrounding borders and migration and human mobilities and immobilities today. So that's why I don't put myself right directly in the field of migration studies. The mobility studies is a much broader field of these many different kinds of mobilities and how they intersect. And I'm just going to talk about a few other key concepts. Climate debt. We are not all equally responsible for climate change, and we are not equally impacted by it. For instance, all of the small island developing countries in the Pacific combined account for only 0.03% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yet sea levels in the Southwest Pacific are rising faster than the global average, and the region has been affected by some of the strongest storms ever recorded in the Southern Hemisphere in the past 10 to 15 years. The entire African continent, with its 54 countries, produces less than 4% of global emissions, while millions of Africans have been internally displaced by climate-related disasters since the early 2020s. Meanwhile, those of us with high energy lifestyles and excessive carbon emissions also benefit from corporate investments and military systems that enable our access to resources, including the resources needed for the sustainability transition, right? Of decarbonization and electrification. And so it's our consumption which is in part driving vulnerability and climate displacement around the world for those who have contributed the least to climate change. To better understand and respond to these complex Anthropocene mobilities, I argue with some of the other authors mentioned on this slide that we should first recharacterize those displaced by climate change rather as displacees of a globalized network of intersecting mobility regimes fueled by fossil fuel extraction, as Andrew Baldwin puts it. Climate change is not simply a universal geophysical process caused by all of humanity, but, Baldwin says, along with Froelich and Rothe, is a manifestation of capitalism and a historically produced structural condition. So vulnerability to climate change is not simply a product of natural conditions or like where you are in the world, but it's a political state and a colonial condition, as Yarimar Bonilla has argued, and it can be understood in terms of the coloniality of climate. A mobility justice frame therefore focuses political attention on the capacity and responsibility of high greenhouse gas emitters to reduce our energy consumption, repay loss and damages, redistribute common goods, and ensure the global right to movement, as well as to support the ability of communities who wish to stay in place. If the wealthiest countries and populations limit our excessive mobility and energy consumption, reduce meat consumption and land use, and more carefully steward other resources, there is enough energy to support all living beings on Earth. The response to the climate emergency then becomes not the problem of climate migration, but the problem of our system of global capitalism that has underwritten such vast social inequities and enabled the excessive extraction of natural resources and the overconsumption of fossil fuels, leaving behind sacrifice zones and sacrificial populations who are most vulnerable now to climate displacement, and who then become the subject of concerns over migration and borders. So I'm going to just very briefly reprise a little bit in this part about narratives of climate migration. I spoke about this in the seminar on Monday, so I don't want to spend too much time on this part because I want to get to mobile commenting. But I just want to say that climate migration takes on different meanings depending on whether it is framed as a security threat, an issue of overpopulation, or as beneficial for those who support retreat to safer places. These different narratives framing climate mobilities and immobilities inform corresponding mindsets, tensions, and critiques around the responses that we have to migration today. Narratives of population growth, for example, drive political and policy responses that blame overpopulation on the developing world where birth rates are generally higher, and use a concept of developed and developing, which implies certain understandings of who can have access to resources, who deserves energy use, and where growth patterns should be allowed. A mobility justice approach recognizes the coloniality of this framing and of the mobility regimes behind it, and argues instead for the need for climate loss and damages to be paid and climate repair and reparations. Rather than the exclusionary lockdown of borders that we are seeing today, I argue for instead focusing on the question of responsibility and reparations in a moral, legal, and financial framework under international law. The growth of the system of deadly corridors, detention camps, and spaces of confinement at our borders, as well as the massive deportation regime that is taking hold in my own country, is an illegal, ineffective, and immoral response that needs to be subjected to critical analysis and alternative frameworks. And this calls for a reparative justice approach that acknowledges the responsibility of the global north for causing loss, damages, and climate displacements. So the term climate refugees has been negatively appropriated into security discourses that drive a fear of refugees supposedly flooding our shores and the corresponding fortress mentality. And many other scholars have written about this, and this has been going on for, I don't know, at least 10 years, this critique of the idea of a flood of migrants framed through a kind of neo-Malthusian notion of overpopulation that is based on the idea that there's a limited carrying capacity of the planet as a whole. And of course, that ignores the fact that greenhouse gas emissions are produced mainly by the consumption habits of wealthy individuals, large corporations, and militaries in the global north, based on resources extracted from the global south. And this image is of a Honduran mother with two little girls crossing the Mexico-US border. Her name is Maria Lila Meza Castro, and they are being tear gassed by United States security forces. Now, this was back in 2018, and things have only gotten worse since then. So why are we doing this to people? Why is this what our borders look like today? And I know here in Europe, we have the people tracking the deaths that happen in the Mediterranean border crossings, in the attempts to get to the islands, in the Atlantic. And all of these borders, including the Eastern European borders, have been really shut down, and increasingly so in recent years. So in contrast to this idea of these climate refugees flooding or invading our nations, and the idea of replacement theory, right, that the white populations are going to be replaced by others, there has been a kind of demonization of those who are critical of that. So those who argue for a more ethical or just or more welcoming, right, culture towards migrants are tagged as being for open borders and who are dangerous to the nation, and themselves become sort of pushed to the margins because it's no longer politically acceptable today to call for some kind of more ethical and responsible and relational attitude towards migrants and migration. And even centrist political parties now, we see move against the idea of open borders or no borders, and anybody who wants to argue anything in between gets pushed into that camp. So in all of these discursive framings, those displaced by climate change are dehumanized. They are seen as others outside of our communities. And this leads to the abandonment of the legal and framework that existed for refugees. And it's encouraged this idea that everyone is illegal, rather than no one is illegal. Now everyone is illegal, and it leads to detention under cruel conditions and deportation back to dangerous places, which are key aspects of mobility and justice. So just in summarizing this part of the argument, I argue that a more ethical policy position would be to reframe Anthropocene mobilities as a broader problem of energy overconsumption within extractive economies for which a climate debt is owed to those who have been harmed and displaced. And this means we need to understand climate mobility justice within the histories of colonialism of the violent, coercive transatlantic system of plantation slavery and indigenous displacement, and how that relates to the present global uneven development, which is premised on anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous, anti-Native ideologies. And this has shaped human vulnerabilities and leads to a future of resistance against ideologies of exclusion and exceptionalism that will influence who has access to resources, to safety, and to preferable ecologies. So that's the kind of critique of the current system. But what I wanted to do today is start to develop this new aspect of work to think about, okay, well, what's the positive narrative? What can we carry forward? What have we learned? And I put this under the title of mobile commoning, to sort of think about what we mean when we speak about mobility justice, climate mobility justice, social movements, kinopolitical struggles. What can we organize around? And mobile commoning is one way to think about what we are organizing around. So I'll begin with political histories of commoning. Commoning is a concept that describes socially produced rules for sharing. Often it draws on the work of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom, who critiqued Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, that argued that commons have always, she argued that commons have always been collectively managed by rules of customary shared usage. The concept of the commons has earlier roots, of course, in the 19th and 20th centuries, and there's a long history of commoners and common law and like pieces of land understood as commons. But I'm speaking specifically to the resurgence of interest in commoning starting in the early 2000s. And it ranges from work like J.K. Gibson Graham's studies of post-capitalist politics and what they call diverse economies. Also work like Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's influential work on Commonwealth, Assembly, Multitudes. You may have seen many of their books. David Bollier and Silke Helfrich's histories of the insurgent power of the commons. And also Silvia Federici and George Kafentzis' critique of the new enclosures, and in particular Federici's feminist analysis of the commons of reproduction. So these discussions of commoning have taken off in many fields, especially concerned with what might be thought of as urban politics from below, and in the activist movements that offer alternatives to capitalism. So the commons, in its traditional sense, may refer to a shared territory, for example, a field, a woodland, a tidal shoreline where people could gather, shellfish, seaweed, firewood. It can refer to a common pool resource, such as fisheries or clean air. And it could even refer to an open source knowledge product, such as open software or the World Wide Web as it was first imagined as a kind of open communication system. These can all be considered different kinds of commons. But most approaches to commoning, and I add that kind of verb tense to it because I think of it not as a resource but as an action. Many of these ideas of commoning have little to say about mobilities or migration because they tend to focus on local practices within existing territories, right? They're thinking about the place, which is the commons or where commoners have access. So they do not say much about the impacts of mobilities on commons or of climate change, which itself, of course, crosses borders. Nor do they think about how climate displacement might be impacting the formation of commons and practices of commoning today. So commoning mobilities is an ongoing, active practice of being mobile with others. It may include things like limiting one's own movement by sharing space. That is, just think about if you're walking or cycling, how do you share space, right? You be careful, you slow down, you avoid others. That in of itself is the creation of a momentary commoning because you're not in your mobility, you're limiting yourself so you don't hit other people, of course. It might be the sharing of space, of public spaces, of vehicles, which allows for the wider co-circulation both of people and of other living things. Think of animals, but also plants, and how they need to move in different ways, and how do we participate in a mobile assemblage with other people and with other more than human beings. Commons are neither private nor public. Mobile commoning suggests a temporary dwelling in motion together with others through relational forms of being and becoming. It refers to radical ways of moving together in the world which sometimes refuse private property and enclosure of the commons and maintains it as a free space of movement. So if you think of the history of commons and commoning, it often rests on the continued use, the continued movement of people in and through and usage of that place keeps it open as a commons and a place of commoning. So what is mobile commoning? This is where mobile commoning crucially can be related to migration studies and borders in ways that have not yet been fully examined within migration studies. Insofar as mobile commoning suggests a temporary practice of dwelling and moving without taking ownership, it tends to resist state-imposed definitions and confinement within bordering practices and rules of citizenship. The everyday politics and practices for commoning mobilities seek to assemble more inclusive, just, and sustainable spaces and practices of shared mobilities that involve the production and reproduction of life in ways that are neither private under a sort of capitalist economy, nor are they public in a purely state-owned sense of the public, but are a kind of mobile third space, a kind of counter-public or subaltern public, which goes back to my early work that was mentioned on democracy after slavery, which was about Black counterpublics in the Atlantic world. In stark contrast to the border walls, barbed wire barriers, and cruel detention centers that are built to deter so-called climate refugees and many other racialized migrants today, mobile commoning implies a kind of full of care movement shared with others based upon forms of solidarity, reciprocity, caring, generosity, and stewardship. Underneath such practices of care, we find not a tragedy of the commons, but instead a source of ecological responsibility and repair. So the twin ideas of mobile commons and commoning mobility have appeared briefly in critical migration studies. In particular, in the work of Papadopoulos and Tsianos, which came out in 2013, they argued that what were called the migrant caravans that were crossing Central America and Mexico, moving towards the United States border, are a form of mobile commons. Being mobile together, sharing routes and resources, offered these Central American migrants some degree of collective protection from the violence of the border regime, whether it was state violence or the violence of the traffickers, called the coyotes, who exploited people on the move. Papadopoulos and Tsianos characterized the mobile commons of migrants as first, the invisible knowledge of mobility, such as knowledge that is shared about transit routes, shelters, border crossings, and so on. Secondly, they describe an infrastructure of connectivity, such as media platforms, word of mouth, and social networks. Third, they describe a multiplicity of informal economies, including knowledge of how to secure short-term work, or how to engage the coyotes, how to get somewhere where you're trying to get to. Fourth, they speak of diverse forms of transnational communities of justice, such as solidarity groups, shelters, and NGOs. And fifth, they speak of the politics of care, such as providing effective support, building trust, or caring for people's relatives. These informal economies and politics of care cross the boundaries between citizens and non-citizens. They build solidarity within and between inhabitants and migrants, becoming an expression of commoning that transcends the borders of ethnic or national belonging. Migrant mobile commoning therefore pushes at the boundaries of mobility injustices and suggests a radical unsettling of borders in a world marked by climate disasters. It responds to unjust displacement caused by forms of urbanization and extended commodified value chains that are increasingly affecting marginalized, indigenous, and racialized communities via land grabs and enclosures of clean water, of the oceans, of forests that people have relied on for millennia for autonomous reproduction outside of capitalism. The processes of enclosure, pollution, extraction, gentrification, and urban so-called development underwrite decommoning and are also driving climate displacement and climate mobilities around the world. But as Silvia Federici argued in Feminism and the Politics of the Commons in an Era of Primitive Accumulation, the new enclosures ironically demonstrate not only that commons have not vanished, but new forms of social cooperation are constantly being produced. So mobile commoning emerges as a response to those decommoning displacements and an effort to continue and to repair life itself. I want to refer to a couple of other examples that come out of Black studies in the American context, Black critical theory. Because mobile commoning is grounded in indigenous and post-slavery practices of freedom and the practices of maroons. I don't know if you use that word here, cimarron, which involve moving and dwelling together as part of human and more than human relations. Black critical theory brings to light diverse existing mobile commoning practices, fugitive mobilities, and radical commoning among formerly enslaved and colonized peoples in the Caribbean and across the Americas, including in Brazil in particular, which continue to inform contemporary cultures of mobile commoning under conditions of climate disruption and displacement. Historian Julius S. Scott was first to identify what he called the common wind in a book of that name as the networks of communication that revealed extensive travel and connectivity across the Black Atlantic and the Caribbean in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Against the dominant mobility and immobility regimes of the system of slavery, there were these elusive, mobile, subaltern counterpublics that have long created ways of life, insurgent movements, and autonomous spaces for Black commons. From the mountains of the Greater Antilles to the swamplands of the low country southern United States, these maroon and fugitive commons drew on deep forms of practice knowledge of living outside of, but next to, and constantly challenging and unmaking violent structures of property ownership, enslavement, and capitalist extraction. Today, these practical knowledges of collective fugitive commoning may be necessary to reproduce life under changing climate ecologies. In her moving book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Saidiya Hartman follows the fugitive commons of the post-slavery period during the Great Migration from the rural South in the United States to the urban North in the early 20th century. This was a period of seeking freedom that mobilized what she describes as restless, anarchic, and wayward populations of the dispossessed. The term wayward describes what she calls the unregulated movement of drifting and wandering, sojourns without a fixed destination, ambulatory possibility, interminable migrations, rush and flight, Black locomotion, the everyday struggle to live free, the attempt to elude capture by never settling. Today's climate migrants, whether displaced by climate disasters in which they remain within a national border or beyond, moving across transnational borders, as well as those who simply find themselves in their homes but repeatedly dispossessed of their shelter, their water, their access to energy due to both natural and man-made impacts of infrastructural injustices, also today form a kind of wayward population, seeking temporary shelter, sharing goods and information with others, moving from place to place, facing instability and drifting. Think of each natural disaster where people, whole communities kind of get dispersed and scattered and have to find somewhere to stay and find a way to reproduce their lives. But what if we think of this also as a form of resistance to dominant regimes of property and private individualism, a resistance to enclosure and decommoning? Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's notion of what they call the fugitive undercommons also mobilizes the idea of commons as a subaltern way of moving through the world, a relational counterposition, an embodied relation with others, and an epistemic perspective from below. They refer to life stolen by the Enlightenment and then stolen back, where the commons can be a refuge and the refuge gives commons. That's a quote. This connects the refuge sought by those fleeing slavery and racism to the more recent practices of refuge seeking, of refugees seeking refuge. It repositions the idea of the refugee as an active practice of fugitive commoning, and hence repositions climate refugees as those who make the commons into a refuge for all, rather than seeking to be incorporated within the borders and the citizenship regimes of violent states. The refugee of the undercommons seeks to dispense with state bordering by claiming every place as a home on the move. As in the post-slavery mobile search for freedom, we can imagine contemporary subaltern climate mobilities as another kind of wayward undercommons of those who are practicing what Hartman called beautiful experiments in mobile commoning, refusing the dominant regimes of citizenship, bordering, enclosure, detention, incarceration, and forcible deportation. So I want to move now towards a conclusion that argues that new ways of anti-colonial living, moving, and being are already being expressed by those who engage in mobile commoning in this age of climate disruption. I think we need to ask, can mobile commoning offer an alternative ethics of care? What does mobile commoning look like in today's situation of climate mobilities, and how might it contribute to ecological survivance? What do we want to see in the world, and what political narrative and epistemes will help bring that about? In the book Beyond Sanctuary, Ananya Roy and Yves Zablotsky point towards what they call counter-cartographies of mobility that are part of a broader repertoire of spatial practices that reinscribe sanctuary through alternative relationalities of solidarity. What do these alternative relationalities consist of? Another slide here. They begin with very simple gestures of commoning, such as grassroots migrant housing projects, autonomous solidarity housing for migrants that help remake the urban commons through what are called infrastructures of decolonial solidarity. And in fact, I saw such a place here in Lisbon. I saw a sign at a building that was welcoming migrants, and in particular, I think it was aimed at Brazilians as a cultural gathering space and a place to get information on where to live, how to get work, how to get different permits. In Roy and Zablotsky's book, Beyond Sanctuary, there's a chapter by Savdaroglu and Kaika. And they point also to cross-border solidarity action networks like the No Border Assembly and No One is Illegal, which are organizations which contest the dehumanization of migrants' camps and prisons. And in all of these cases, there's an experimentation with forms of coexistence and what they call symbiosis within the urban fabric, whether sharing self-managed collective gardens for food, self-creating housing projects, or making cooperatives for self-organized healthcare, education, or work. All of these are forms of social reproduction beyond capitalism, which reject the logic of the refugee camp, the logic of the productive migrant, and reject the humanitarian gesture as charity for outsiders. Instead, they assert the autonomy of migration and the self-determination of the mobile collective. Mobile commoning, then, is not a future utopia, but is already here now. It potentially offers a way to build alliances between migrating people and those already in a place. Rather than pitting citizens against migrants, it offers a way of planning in common together, especially in these times of climate distress and ecological unraveling. And I'll end with this photo from the recent Artemis 2 space trip to the moon, photo taken by the 4 American astronauts from the capsule Integrity. And I'll say migrant mobile commoning pushes at the boundaries of existing injustices and suggests a radical unsettling of borders in a world marked by climate disasters and displacement. It offers an alternative ethics of care. It can help us begin to see in the world the kind of political narrative and episteme that will help bring back that alternative. And it asks that we all move over this earth more lightly, with care and concern for others, both human and more than human. We can imagine such infrastructures of connectivity and care via informal economies and relational mobilities of reproduction that have always been part of the anti-colonial and anti-capitalist cultures of fugitivity, marronage, cross-border mobilities, and transnational diasporic and cosmopolitan forms of belonging. More hopeful political orientations and more just climate futures might arise from these ongoing experiments with mobile commoning that have appeared and continue to appear amongst those who have resisted enclosure, enslavement, ecocide, displacement, pollution, and extractive exploitation, and who have reclaimed their own autonomous mobilities. It is in such a future that migration and mobilities of all kinds will be a regular part of our everyday lives, understood as a sensible and sensitive response to varying climate conditions. Mobile commoning will be, and perhaps already is and always was, the way in which we maintain life on a moving, changing, living planet in which we are all subject to climate mobilities and immobilities. Thank you.